Commander Arthur Vance sat in the observation cupola of the Ethelgard outpost, eyes fixed on the swirling chaos of Jupiter's upper atmosphere. Below him, the gas giant pulsed with violent energy, a gargantuan beast ignoring him entirely. Vance wasn't here for the view. He was a sentinel for a fading civilization, searching for the heavy isotopes that could reignite the ancient fusion reactors of a desperate Earth. Every hour spent in this lonely orbit was a trade his health and his sanity for the slim hope of a future. To him, the cold Jupiter's clouds were the last storehouse of a dying world. He clutched a small, worn photograph of his wife and daughter, a paper lifeline connecting him to the home he was trying to save. Outside the transparency, the cosmos stretched into an infinite blackness. It was a sight that had driven explorers to their knees, but Vance knew the truth. The silence was not peaceful, it was predatory. The vacuum was a perfect, hungry void, waiting for the slightest crack in his defenses. It wasn't just the lack of oxygen that killed, it was the physics of decompression. Without pressure, his life-sustaining liquids would betray him. The boiling point of his blood would drop, turning his veins into a network of steam and agony. Space didn't just suffocate. It unmade you from within, tearing the gases out of your tissues. When he prepared for maintenance, the ritual of donning his EVA suit felt like a religious ceremony. Each of the 14 layers was a line of defense against a universe that hated him. There was the cooling garment, tubes preventing his heart from overheating in the solar glare. Then came the pressurized bladder, nylon and mylar reflecting the searing radiation. Yet, for all its complexity, the suit was a fragile bubble. 1 millimeter of puncture was all it took for his internal pressure to vanish, leaving him a frozen statue in seconds. Inside, the only sound was the rhythmic hiss of oxygen and his own heart. It happened in a flash of kinetic violence, a sharp metallic thrum vibrating through the floor. A speck of dust, no larger than a grain of sand but traveling at 17,000 miles per hour, had found its mark. It punched through the shielding like a bullet through paper, vaporizing the aluminum hull upon impact. Vance watched the pressure gauge flicker a microleak. It was a reminder that in the great abyss, even the smallest debris possessed the energy of a freight train. In space, speed was the ultimate weapon, and the galaxy was full of projectiles waiting to tear through bone and steel. He could feel the cold seepage of the vacuum pulling at the very atoms of the station. As he moved to seal the breach, a familiar blurriness clouded his vision. This was space blindness, the VIP syndrome haunting long-term astronauts. Without gravity to pull fluids downward, the pressure in his skull was rising, flattening his eyeballs and inflaming his optic nerves. His brain was being reshaped by weightlessness, a metamorphosis that threatened permanent darkness. He blinked hard, trying to focus on the tiny red warning lights. His fragile body was rebelling against the lack of a world to stand on. His heart labored, and now his very sight was being stolen by the dark and infinite void that surrounded his every moment. Suddenly, the station's emergency klaxon wailed, an ominous sound cutting through the recycled air. The long-range sensors screamed a warning. A massive coronal mass ejection had erupted from the sun, a wall of high-energy protons hurtling toward Jupiter at millions of miles per hour. Vance rushed to the console, hands trembling as data cascaded across screens. The deadly magnetic shielding was showing a critical malfunction. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The silent fire was coming, a wave of radiation ready to shred his DNA, and the shielding was finally failing. The storm arrived not with a bang, but with a silent subatomic assault. These were high-energy protons, invisible needles traveling at near-light speeds, capable of passing through inches of lead as if it were mist. Inside the station, Vance could almost feel them, a phantom prickling against his skin, a metallic taste blooming on his tongue. This was the invisible killer, the silent fire of the cosmos. Every particle that pierced the hull was a microscopic bullet aimed at his genetic code. They didn't just strike him, they shredded his DNA, breaking the molecular ladders that held his biological identity together. In the quiet of the cockpit, His body was becoming a battlefield where cells were being forced into mutations that would inevitably lead to organ failure or the slow, agonizing bloom of cancer. Space was not just a vacuum. It was a radioactive furnace that viewed human flesh as nothing more than perishable chemical fuel. Between the bursts of radiation, a different kind of rot began to take hold, the decay of the spirit. Looking out at the vast, swirling storms of Jupiter, Vance experienced a dark inversion of the overview effect. Where other astronauts felt a sense of unity, he felt only a crushing, absolute isolation. Earth was a pale, microscopic speck, millions of miles away, lost in the glare of a distant sun. The distance began to warp his perception of reality. This was solipsism syndrome, the creeping psychological horror where the mind, stripped of its familiar environment, begins to believe that the external world is a fabrication. The station, the stars, the giant planet below, they all started to feel like a dream, a simulation generated by a dying brain. He caught himself staring at the photo of his family, but their faces seemed like strangers from a forgotten life. He was a ghost haunting a metal coffin, drifting through a void that didn't acknowledge his existence. Just as the mental fog thickened, a physical one followed. The life support display flickered, and the steady hum of the carbon dioxide scrubbers changed pitch, descending into a guttering rattle. The chemical beds were saturated, and the air was slowly turning toxic. Vance felt the first signs of hypercapnia, a dull ache behind his eyes and a sudden, inexplicable surge of panic. His breathing became shallow and rapid, his lungs burning as they recycled the same stale, heavy air. The carbon dioxide was a silent thief, stealing his clarity and replacing it with a terrifying primal confusion. He felt like he was drowning while standing up, gasping for a breath that provided no relief. Every thought was a struggle through molasses. Every movement required a Herculean effort of will. The station was no longer a home, it was a suffocating metallic trap. To survive, he had to act. The magnetic shielding required a manual bypass on the exterior hull, and he was the only one who could do it. Clumsily, he forced his radiation-seared body into the EVA suit. Stepping out into the airlock, he felt the heavy thud of the outer hatch opening. Before him lay the great abyss. He was tethered to a spinning metal needle dangling over the gas giant's swirling eye. But mid-repair, a hairline fracture in his suit's cooling system released a stream of water into his helmet. In microgravity, water doesn't fall, it clings. The liquid began to crawl across his face, drawn by surface tension toward his nose and mouth. He was literally drowning inside his spacesuit, millions of miles from any ocean. Through the blur of the rising water, he looked down at the great red spot. In that moment of suffocating terror, he saw the universe for what it truly was. It wasn't a monster trying to kill him, nor was it a guardian. It was a machine of infinite scale and absolute indifference. The stars didn't care if he choked. He was a speck of carbon struggling against laws of physics that had no room for mercy. Vance clawed at his chest, his fingers fumbling with the manual controls through thick, pressurized gloves. The water was a suffocating mask, a cold, clear parasite that adhered to his skin and crept into his nostrils. Every instinct screamed for him to inhale, but he knew that a single breath would draw the liquid deep into his lungs, ending his life in a silent, watery grave. With a final, desperate jerk, he triggered the emergency oxygen purge. A violent blast of high-pressure gas roared into the helmet, shattering the surface tension and spraying the water into 1,000 tiny droplets that danced like diamonds before being sucked into the suit's filtration intake. The reprieve was instantaneous, but the cost was devastating. The purge had depleted his primary oxygen reserves. The HUD flashed a cruel crimson warning. 4 minutes of life remained. He was a dead man walking, yet the job remained. With trembling hands, he slammed the final bypass switch and locked the magnetic shielding into place, just as the first wave of the solar storm's heavy ions slammed into the outpost. The sky didn't change, but his instruments went insane. Static screamed in his ears, a chaotic roar of celestial interference that drowned out the hum of his suit. He scrambled back toward the airlock, his movements frantic. Behind him, the very fabric of space seemed to shimmer with ghostly light. As he cycled the airlock and tumbled back into the station's interior, the electronics began to groan. Violent, shimmering auroras began to dance inside the cabin as the electromagnetic pulse bled through the hull. Tiny sparks jumped between panels, and the air smelled of ozone. He was the conductor in a silent cosmic hurricane. He collapsed onto the cold, metallic deck plating, his body finally surrendering to the immense strain. The radiation spike had been brief, but its passage was absolute. He could feel a deep, throbbing ache in his marrow, a sign that the subatomic bombardment had done its work. His skin was flushed, his joints stiffening as if filled with lead. He was no longer the man who had left Earth. He was a ghost in a decaying shell, a man who had sacrificed his future for a world he would never see again. He was alive, but broken. His vision was permanently blurred, the VIP syndrome having finally pushed his optic nerves to their breaking point. Through the haze, he saw the flickering green light of the communications terminal. The data was finally moving. The telemetry he had nearly died to secure was streaming across the void, a digital binary lifeline being cast toward the dying Earth. It contained the complex maps of the Jovian moon's mineral deposits, the gravitational resonance data needed to guide the next colony ship, and the chemical signatures of deep-crust water. His suffering, the drowning in the suit, the radiation-scorched DNA, the isolation that had almost cracked his mind. It all had a weight now. It wasn't just pain, it was the price of a future for others. He had traded his health for the survival of a species that would never know his name. There was a quiet, somber peace in that realization, a warmth that countered the absolute zero of the void outside. We go to the stars not because they are welcoming, but because they are the ultimate crucible. Space is a cold, infinite predator that waits for a single mistake to devour us. It is the most dangerous place in the universe because it demands everything and offers no comfort in return. It tests the core of the human spirit, stripping away everything until only the raw, unbreakable will to endure remains. Vance looked at the crumpled photograph of his family taped to the console. He would never feel the warmth of a real sun again. He was a martyr for the cause of human progress, a lonely sentinel at the edge of the dark, cold abyss. As the Ethelgard outpost drifted over the massive clouds of Jupiter, it looked like a speck of dust against the giant's massive, indifferent gaze, a tiny spark of life that refused to be extinguished.